Hey folks, this just in. The CEO of Onlyfans, the creator of Onlyfans, is dead at 43 of cancer. I've seen a lot of jokes about this. White smoke up in Tel Aviv let you know that a new Onlyfans CEO has been appointed. It's not so much about him or about who makes Onlyfans, but really Onlyfans is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the internet, which is when you have a space with few or no rules, you're going to have its use be directed towards the degenerate. And this is because other spaces have rules. And so people gravitate towards rule-free spaces when they want to do things that are not allowed in other places. So if you guys remember the early 2000s, maybe you're too young to remember the early 2000s, or maybe you're old enough to remember it, and you remember the jokes that we had in mass media, like Futurama had this joke about how the internet was, or Fry was like, the internet was only really used for porno when I was back in the 20th century. That's all it's used for now. And it's like, this informative video is pornography, right? That this idea that the internet was almost entirely porn. And we used to do this joke, or not a joke, but like this funny little game that we thought was funny, like back in 2008, where you would Google two words. You would Google any two words, and we had a rule like it couldn't be technical words, right? Like you couldn't Google like xylene and string theory or something, right? You couldn't. You could just Google two random words, and your goal was to see how quickly you could see pornography in the image results. Because you could type in any word, you could type in hot dog, and like the second picture would be porn. That's how it was back then. That's how much pornography was distributed across the internet. This is before the days of MindGeek, and you guys can research who owns MindGeek. You can try to find out who owns MindGeek. And I encourage you to try to figure that out, because you'll find that it's a little bit obfuscated. And what is MindGeek? Well, it's the company that owns basically all of the pornography on the internet now. But they created like Pornhub and some of these other sites that aggregated content off of other people's personal sites, basically stole the content, and users were the ones that were allowed to put it on there. So they could just kind of avoid any kind of legal culpability for stolen content. Everybody's personal sites got shut down. OnlyFans really is filling in a gap that was created by MindGeek sort of sucking up all the porno on the internet and running all the independent people out of business. But anyway, if you go back to the early 2000s, you find there was just an abundance of pornography on the internet. That was one of the first things that actually interested us in the 90s of the internet. It's like, there's a bunch of porn on the internet. It's like, what? It's like, you could just look up naked pictures on the internet. This is before the days of high-speed internet where you could look at video, right? And so you'd try to load the picture, they're like slowly loading. You're like, oh, I hope mom doesn't get home. So that's what it was in the 90s, guys. So this idea, like, why is there so much porno on the internet? Well, the reason is you can't have porno everywhere else. People enforce rules. There's no pornography at the drugstore. Because there's none at the drugstore, you have to go to some weird place to get it. Sometimes gas stations would have it, but you have to go to adult bookstore, adult video store in order to get it. And it's like the internet gives you an anonymous place where you can just get the thing. You just have the thing. So in a rule-free environment or a low-rule environment, you have it directed towards degeneracy. It's like Silk Road could have been used for lots of things, but it was mostly used for drug contracts. The early days of Bitcoin, people don't remember this. Why didn't everyone want Bitcoin back in whenever it came out? I was around, and it was just like even back then, it's like mining Bitcoin costs more. It costs more to mine a Bitcoin than it's actually worth in dollars. That sounds weird when Bitcoin was like $10, right? But it would cost more than $10 of electricity to mine a Bitcoin. Well, you only really use Bitcoin to buy drugs online or hire hitmen. That's what people use Bitcoins for. So the idea that you would buy Bitcoin as some sort of store of value just hadn't really entered into the thought processes of people. And that's because it was basically a low rule environment early on. So OnlyFans wasn't necessarily created for pornographic use. It wasn't created for people to create adult content. It was created for people to monetize their followers, right? To basically like Patreon, but a lower rule Patreon. but it got turned towards the degenerate because that's the way people could do it. Is that they didn't have any other options for how they could easily do this. Like, you can't charge subscriptions on Twitter for adult content that I know of, and they certainly couldn't a couple of years ago. So OnlyFans became the place where that happens. And I think you could see this in any environment, any place where there's fewer rules than somewhere else locally. And I know that we're talking about the internet, so locally is like metaphorically locally. Then it's going to be turned towards degenerate uses. Imagine if you had an eBay with no rules about what you could buy or sell. What would you expect to find on that site? Well, I know what I would expect to find is a bunch of drugs or prostitution contracts. It's kind of like Backpage. Backpage didn't have rules. What was Backpage used? It was used, prostitutes used it, right? So whenever you have a rule-free space, it just gets directed towards the most degenerate stuff because other spaces have rules. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. But you give me your thoughts and opinions on this. I think there's a reason that so many of our things get directed towards ends that we don't want. It's like we want freedom. We want people to have a maximal amount of freedom, but in any local environment, the rules really matter. You know, the rules really matter. If you have just like a rule-free environment, then it's going to gravitate the worst people towards it. And I think you see that with like alt tech as well. Alt tech are people that got ghettoized out of like mainstream tech. And so it's always like more extreme than what you would expect to get. Like, it's not, it doesn't end up being social media or, Twitter, but more free. It ends up being crazy degenerate trash and like absolute insanity versus Twitter, which has just a tiny bit of that, right? So anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Leave me your thoughts down below. I'd love to know what you guys think about my little hypothesis there, and what you happen to think about OnlyFans and maybe MindGeek or just the internet in general, and the kind of free nature of the internet and how we've seen it be turned to various purposes that most people would be like, well, I wouldn't choose to do that, but why did that become so popular? I would love to have maybe another alternative hypothesis from the one that I'm giving here. So have a great one, and I'll see you all next time. Have a great day.